Buenos días a todos. Estamos del Fan de Lugo con esta sección de entrevistas. Hoy tenemos el placer de tener otra vez al profesor Philipp Bagus y vamos a hablar otra vez sobre el coronavirus, pero esta vez sobre un artículo que acabo de escribir sobre el coronavirus y el impacto que puede tener el Estado sobre la histeria colectiva, y donde me parece que hay puntos muy interesantes y creo que para el debate pues nos viene bien profundizar. El profesor Philipp Bagus es profesor en la Universidad de Juan Carlos y escribió muchísimos libros y ensayos, sobre todo la tragedia del euro, porque los ricos se hacen más ricos a tu costa, eh, y otros. Creo que su último libro es sobre Small is Beautiful. No sé si ha sido traducido al español, pero seguramente es buena lectura. Procederemos en inglés, ya que el artículo es en inglés y vamos pues profundizando sobre los varios temas. Professor Bagus, thank you very much for being with us. It's always a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. It's a great pleasure to talk with you today again.
So this article of yours, which was published in the International Journal of Environmental Research on Public Health, quite recently, I guess. I've seen that all of your data is actually very recent. How did it come about? How is it related to we've been talking, the past, I think we're many months ago now, but with regards to the economic consequences of the virus and the political consequences and how this would affect the banking system and so forth. How does this relate to your study? I mean, since the beginning of the lockdown, you've been, I think, very much focused on all these issues, trying to develop them in great complexity, right? From the economic point of view, the ethical point of view, and now you touch also another very important matter, right? Collective hysteria or mass hysteria. How does this relate? How did it come about? How did this research plan come about?
Yeah, I guess one way to deal with the difficult situation is for me to write about it, to analyze it. And also because the situation is psychologically very difficult for everyone, because normal life has totally changed, and there's anxiety all around. So one has to deal with it. How it came about, this was actually some articles that were sent to me by student of the master of Juan Carlos, an old student who did his PhD, Christian Schneider, and he sent me some articles on mass hysteria. And then I investigated on it, and I thought it would be very interesting. And then we started to write, my co-authors and I, we wrote an article, which is the political economy of mass hysteria. That is, we compare how different institutional settings influence the possibility and the extension and the distraction that can produce a mass hysteria, comparing a minimal state, and the same is of course a fortiori true for a private law society, with a modern welfare state. Yeah. So let me maybe explain first what a mass hysteria is. So in a mass hysteria or collective hysteria, many people overestimate an existing threat or even a non-existing threat. So there's an overestimation of an existing or non-existing threat, and the anxiety, fear develops. And here an important point is that fear and anxiety is contagious. Same way as viruses are contagious, feelings, emotions are also contagious, and especially fear and anxiety. So then a whole collective gets infected by this anxiety and reacts quite irrational. And sometimes they can even get symptoms. Yeah. Sometimes they get symptoms, and there are many studies on collective hysteria, mass hysteria, so it's very well studied in the literature. The only thing is that these studies concern more restricted areas like schools where mass hysteria break out, or factories, many on factories. There's one example there. Some worker in Singapore in a factory sees a bug he's never seen, and then it starts like aching, or and he gets symptoms, and then one starts and others start too. And at the end, the whole factory, they have real symptoms, so physiological symptoms they have, and they fall ill. And at the end, it's the bug, if there was one, was no threat at all. So they overestimate a threat. Another interesting point is the one of to explain the case of the nocebo effects. Nocebo effects are the opposite of placebo effects. The placebo effect is you take a medicine and you think you will get better, and you get better because you think you will get better. Nocebo is different. You think you will get ill, and therefore you actually get ill. In the same way that you actually get better with the placebo, you actually get worse through the nocebo effect, because you think so. So it's psychological. And there's the case of this one patient who was like in a drug experiment or study of a new drug, and he was thinking he was taking an experimental drug, and then he wanted to commit suicide, so he took 29 pills of this experimental drug, and then he had the symptoms. The heartbeat went up, and he was close to dying. He went to the hospital, and then they called, and they could stabilize him somehow, but he almost died. And then they called the doctor who was responsible for this medical trial, and he said, well, he was in the control group, only taking placebos. so he was trying to kill himself with placebos, and he got and when the doctor told him, he immediately got better and could be released 15 minutes later. So you see how this is all very much psychological. And one of these authors who talk about mass hysteria, they also say we may actually underestimate the extent of what this happens, because we only look at pure cases when there's nothing, like a bug that makes nothing, and then there comes. But sometimes this mass hysteria can be on top of an existing illness. So there's an illness, but through the fear, anxiety, and mass hysteria, the symptoms are more severe, which are more the gray areas, I guess. And this is possible, of course, that this happened with the coronavirus, this overestimation of a threat. I mean, there's much anecdotal evidence that we see people in cars driving alone, wearing masks. People isolate even though they are young, and the probability to die is basically zero for them. But they are scared. They are very scared to death, basically. So I would think, but this would have to be investigated in more detail, that we live right now in a mass hysteria. But this aside, we study what is the probability to such a thing develop, a mass hysteria to develop, in a free society, minimal state versus a buffer state. And there we look at different factors. One are the factors that actually reduce the stress, because stress is always a factor that is very, in all the studies, it fosters the development of mass hysteria. And of course, there are strategies that reduce mass hysteria, which are doing sports, having fun in company with others, get a diversion, distracted from the threat, not always thinking on them, but just play with people, have fun with them, meet with them, do sports, get sun outside. So these are all stress-reducing factors, which, when a mass hysteria would break out in a free society, people would be allowed to do. which then limits the extent of the mass hysteria. Unfortunately, the state, when mass hysteria breaks out, he's likely to contribute to the stress and he did during the corona crisis, by prohibiting exactly these activities that would reduce the stress and anxiety that people had. Yeah, if you lock people up in a lockdown, they are not allowed to meet and socialize and go out, even go outside. Of course, they get depressed and they get anxiety, and this is a perfect state for mass hysteria to develop. Yeah, and then very important is, of course, the harm that the mass hysteria, the havoc that the mass hysteria can produce. Even if we have in a minimal state or that protects private property rights or a free society, we have a mass hysteria, and it's possible because evolutionary, we have this negativity bias of the human mind. So we look at negative news. Why? Because our ancestors, if they would not focus on negative news, they would die, basically. So if there's a threat, we have to focus on it. So as we focus on negative news, we have this negativity bias in the human brain. We are prone of overestimating the threats, and this can spread. So this could also happen in a free society. But if people fall prey to this, succumb to this mass hysteria in a free society, at least there are limits to the destruction that can be done, which is private property rights. The problem, if a state exists, is, well, one thing, of course, that the mass hysteria can take hold of the government itself, so that the government itself acts hysterically and acts irrational, and second, that there are no limits to the destruction they can do, because they don't care for private property rights. Yeah, they don't even care for constitutions, as we have seen. They don't care at all. So they may, by overreacting to the threat, yeah, they may produce incredible destruction and losses to society in general, be it psychological, be it from a health perspective or economically, yeah, with disastrous long-term consequences. In a free society, this could not the limit to this is private property rights that would limit the danger, the irrationality or the panic or the collective hysteria could bring about. And then there, of course, yeah.
Please go.
Yeah, so, and then another factor that we have in a free society or minimal state is that we can decentralize minimal state. That is, that we can have experiments. That is, people can try different ways to deal with the threat, with the imagined or unimagined threat. And then other people can observe this and say, hey, maybe this is a way to go. So in a free society, of course, all people, they could close their businesses, they could wear masks, they could isolate, they are free to do so. But others are also free to experiment and say, hey, I open my business and maybe I oblige you to wear masks or not, or I take you the temperature, and others experiment and say, okay, old people can come for certain hours, young people can come for other hours, and other people say, maybe just saying, I open my business as always. So we have different experiments here, and we can observe the results. Yeah, and maybe if I have this anxiety and I'm very feared that I will die from this threat, from the virus, maybe from an epidemic, but I'm still in a borderline case, and I observe, the people going to these people, they meet up, they socialize, they go to the shop, and later on they don't die like flies. So if I observe this, then I may be rescued in the sense that I don't succumb to the mass hysteria. Yeah. So I disjoin the group of the mass hysterics and go to the other group that hasn't fallen prey to hasn't succumbed to the hysteria. With the state, this is ruled out because the state says, well, no experiments here. We will lock down the whole economy, we will close all schools, or we will close at certain hours, or we will close everything down. So if I have succumbed to the mass hysteria, or I'm close to do so, I have no way to look. I have no way to look if things could be done otherwise. Imagine that we would have a world government. We would have not even comparisons with other countries. Yeah, now we have at least different countries where we can see that things can be done differently. We have Sweden, we have Japan. We have also difference between European countries. Yeah, so at least this kind of experimentation can still be done. But in a free society, people would be totally free to experiment, and this would give information that would be necessary to not to succumb to a hysteria. Because if we don't have the information, then it's much more easy that we get frightened and get the anxiety. And related to this is, of course, that the government has much authority, and there are also studies on this. Like when we get negative information from an authoritative source, like the government, then this produces much more anxiety and stress, and then through contagion it goes to other people. So if the government says, well, there's a terrible virus, this is deadly virus, 10 times more deadly than the normal influenza virus, then this has another effect than in a free society. In a free society, there's no Fauci that goes to Congress and speaks out of Congress to all American people, for example, and say that this is a killer virus. There's no one. There's no Fauci. There's no Congress, which would have the authority. So the non-existence of this central authority, yeah, and in a free society helps to prevent the development of mass hysteria in the first place. Yeah, because when we have this centralized authority and it talks about a threat, it can be also not only virus, it could be terrorism or foreign attack. Yeah, the Russians are going to attack us or whatever, or Saddam Hussein is launching weapons of mass destructions to us. Then it's if the government says it, it has this authority, then it's much easier for mass hysteria to develop. And this is, of course, yeah.
Wouldn't one objection might be, or at least something that you might answer is, even though maybe we wouldn't have a Fauci or the other virologists who have been playing the role models and the protagonists in all of this crisis, still we would have elites, so to speak, or authorities, even within a private law society. So how distinct would this role be compared to a Fauci? Would it be simply a matter of a grade, let's say, of extent of the fact that Fauci, is head, or at least represents or is very much connected to or speaks on behalf of the central government, and maybe a person from a national elite would have less power? But how, given the fact that you would have authorities, right, even in a private law society, how different would this role be with regards to something like hysteria or mass hysteria developing?
Yeah, of course, there would be competition between different elites, so it would not be like one, but there would be several decentralized members of society that would have certain prestige, authority, and they would compete with each other, and they would not say the same thing. One would say that's very dangerous, others not. But there would not be a centralized, authorized source that would say almost sacred, because you remember when people entered the sacred halls of Congress on January 6th, it was like a huge outcry because, like, sacred, this building is sacred. Imagine Fauci standing in this building saying this virus is 10 times more deadly than a normal flu virus. So this sacred thing there would not be. And of course, the natural elites, they would have the prestige because of their merits, because of what they did in the past, not because they had good connections to politics, like Fauci. I mean, Fauci is there because he is a politician, basically, a virologist politician, and he's not a natural elite in the sense that he got there through the way he behaved and through his merits, what he did in the past, for society, but just out of political reasons. So I think these are the differences. And then we have the other factor that contributes to mass hysteria today is a politicized mass media. So it's much more likely for a mass hysteria to develop when a mass media repetitively sends out scare messages. And there are studies that mass media, they scare people by focusing on the bad news, even though there were good news, even in times where infection rates were falling, headlines of rising infection rates were. So, I mean, this is for one thing. That's of course this kind of logical, because negative news sells much better than good news. But the problem comes in when the mass media is connected with the government. We have a politicized mass media. We have state TV channels. We have state licenses for TV channels or radio channels. We have media that get their news from the government, from politicians, and in exchange, they portray the government, of course, in the narrative as the great saver. Then the narrative that sells is there's a huge threat and the government is here to help you. And then they get privileged news from politicians. And of course, we have also politicized media because universities are politicized. We have state universities, and the people who get journalistic degrees go through state universities and are in favor, basically pro government. So when the government then comes with fear messages and is helped and by politicized mass media that repeats the bad news, negative news all day, 24 hours, numbers of deaths, number of infection rates. I mean, it's almost impossible to not become crazy, not become scared for your life, and very, very anxious, and for mass hysteria to develop. And we have to remember that government rests on fear. Governments actively instill fear in the populations, because that is how they sell their existence. They say, well, without us, there are huge threats, and we are here to save you against these threats. And these threats have always been used to increase government power. One is this terrorism thing. There's a threat of terrorism, therefore we have to increase the size of governments, invade your liberties. There's the threat of Saddam Hussein attacking us with weapons of mass destruction, therefore we have to invade Iraq, and government power, the military increases. So government all the time uses this fear. Fear is the foundation of governments. So if governments actively instill fear in the population, of course, it's much more likely that the mass hysteria develops and runs out of control. And we have actually here the case of Germany, where some, and a few days ago, there more information leaked, emails were leaked to the press, where they actually asked experts to make a paper that scares the population. And in an internal paper to the government, these experts actually last April recommended the government to instill fear in the population, the German government. How to do it? They said, well, there's this anxious threat or anxious belief or anxious, how do you say, fear of human beings to die through suffocation. This is like a natural fear that every human being is like very scared to die out of suffocation, not to have enough air. So government emphasized that through the coronavirus, you will die through this. Yeah, because this instills fear in people. And we know this, yeah. The other thing was try to emphasize that there may be long-term adverse consequences. That even though you get better from coronavirus, it may be that some years later you just die. Yeah, emphasize this possibility. And the third thing that they recommended, these experts recommended to the governments in order to instill fear in the population, to get support for the lockdowns, of course, was to say, to instill this guilt or create guilt feelings, for example, especially for children, to tell them, if you play with other children, you might get the virus and then you infect your grandparents and they will have a horrible death at home. Yeah. So they played all psychological tricks to actually instill fear in the population. Yeah. So if you have such governments that actively try to instill fear in the population to increase their power, then a mass hysteria becomes much more likely. And of course, all of this would not exist in a free society. Yeah. And the last point is that politicians face an asymmetric payoff with reacting to threats. If they underestimate the threat, then they will be hanged and feathered and tiered, no, basically, because the people will say, well, how could you underestimate this threat? And they will vote them out. If they overestimate a threat, first of all, they have the media to legitimize their action. And if they overestimate it, there will be no bad consequences for them. People might say, oh, it was better to be careful. And by overreacting to the threat, the cost of the action they can externalize on others. Yeah, these politicians, and they impose a lockdown. Who has the cost of this lockdown? They have a fixed salary, so they are happy. They will get their money, the taxpayers' money. The costs are paying others. The costs are the people whose shops are closed, whose jobs are lost. Yeah. Who cannot sleep at night because they don't know how they economically will make it in the future. So they are able to externalize the costs of their actions on others, which makes much more likely that they will overreact to a threat. And if they overreact to a threat, then a mass hysteria becomes more likely.
In this regard, it's there's this interesting article. It's an interview, right, given by Hans Hoppe, where he actually stresses this point, right, that
exactly,
it's an institutional problem whereby the political elites, right, do not bear the cost directly, the cost of their actions, and in the medium to the long run, they know they have their positions maintained, their salaries continue to get received, and so they do not know the particulars of time and place, the various risk perceptions of the public, right, or in different situations. So they cannot systematically be right in their assessments and in their policies, and they tend to, as you say, overreact. Yet, as you point out, fear is a double-edged sword, right? You might ultimately instill too much fear that the public wakens up. You use the example, you point out to the example of the great fear, the Grand Peur, during the French Revolution, when people were instilled with this fear, and they thought the aristocrats were planning, right, to starve them, and then they started revolting. So there is this double-edged sword, but I don't see it now as applied to the COVID. I mean, there are reactions, right? At least in Europe, there are reactions. There are protests, but I do not see this movement, intellectual movement, ideological movement, whereby people say enough is enough. I don't know what do you think about this? Do you think it can still be used in a, like, fear is still a double-edged sword even in our scenario?
Yeah, with the Grand Peur, of course, this was rumors that the aristocrats would try to starve to death the peasants, and that led then to the revolution. No, so this was not a rumor that was spread by the government. It was, yeah. So, but yeah, if there's a mass panic, like in this case of the Grand Peur, then it also can be also threaten the government, of course. But when I talk about the fear, that fear is the foundation of government, is that is a fear that the government actually instills in the people, so that it gets more support. Yeah, because it says, well, there's this fear that we are threatened by foreign attackers or this virus or whatever, and we are here to help you, to save you. If the question is if you could overdo it in the sense that, yeah, I mean, right now people almost have so much anxiety and fear, they do everything that the government says. I mean, it's incredible. No one would have thought that people would follow orders of governments like this. Yeah, if the government would say, "Yeah, we will make tests in your nose or your anus, or you put something in your face." Someone would have said this 2 years ago or 1 year ago. No one would have believed that. But through fear, it's very easy to control people. If people have fear, they give up their liberties and they do what they are told. Of course, there's a counter-reaction you're talking about, that there are some people, there's always a counter-reaction, yeah. So the question is if there is hope from it. Well, one thing is, of course, we wrote this article exactly to because we think there's hope, and people
to promote fear in the good way, right?
Yeah, to help against this, yeah, and that people have actually some backing also, because it's a scientific journal, actually high-ranked journal, and people can always say science says. Yeah, they can now say science says there may be a mass hysteria and government is overreacting. So I think this is important to have this also, like the scientific backing.
That's very extremely high views. It had a lot of success.
Yeah, we are close to, it's only 1 week, I think, published, and I think, I don't know why, but we have 20,000 readers already. 20,000, which, like, it's incredible. It's incredible. I don't know why. I saw it was posted on Reddit, but I'm not sure if this can have such an effect. But of course, many people are waking up and are feeling. So I guess that for many people, this article could be attractive to get more background, scientific background of what is a mass hysteria, what can contribute to it, and which consequences it can have. So I think there is a market for this. But 20,000 views or accesses to the articles are of course incredible for an academic article. So yeah, there is this interest, and maybe more people are waking up, and I suppose it's the only way to get out of this, because otherwise they will continue with the lockdowns for forever. Yeah, if people don't wake up, and people are starting to wake up, because also they see that economically and psychologically and from a health perspective, things are getting worse. And if we can spread this message to more people, maybe this process gets faster. And it's important, because every day these lockdowns continue, there's incredible harm done to the population, especially to young people. Yeah, young people that are in the best years of their ages, and they have to socialize If they don't, they will be traumatized. Of course, you know the problems of domestic violence and so on, which increases because of the stress levels and frustration and so on. I mean, this has everything long-term consequences. So the faster this stops, the better.
It's something interesting that all of these issues were present right from the beginning. That we always said that closing up an economy or putting these kind of restrictions always had some costs, some costs that were not easily seen, or were more, as Sebastian would say, or Hazlitt would say, more invisible or towards the long term. But we're always closer to that long term, right? And people are not reawakening, but they're starting to look at things. I think that it's a sociologically, anthropologically true thing that when people feel that they're in a crisis and they look at the world in a very negative way, that on the one hand they have fear, they're more, how do you say, easily manipulated, but at the same time they tend to be more realistic about things when they feel that actually their lives are very much worse than what they were before. I know that now they talk about the vaccine, and I think they also use this vaccine or the idea of the vaccine to keep calm, so, say, okay, we'll end soon. And it seems to me also that they, not maybe purposefully or intentionally, but in some way they use this also to give a justification for their policy, saying no worries, it will only last for a small period of time, because once everybody gets vaccinated and so forth, then, and you see in the population that people are sort of buy into this, but it's definitely the case, as you say, and for those who haven't read the article, I would really insist they read them, because apart from the theoretical base of what we were just talking, there are many interesting cases of mass hysteria, which just to give you some example that I liked was the one that happened in 1938, after the radio play of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, where there's an attack on behalf of the Martians on the Earth, and suddenly some people started developing this idea. Probably, you say, because of the Munich Agreement, or at least the uncertainty, right, derived from the Munich Agreement, that they fell into panic, thinking that really the Martians were actually invading them, and you see some similar things. Then you point out different examples of a Portuguese TV show, also the Emirates flight in 2018, which I think is the most recent examples. And it's definitely the case, as you point out also, although the article isn't related to this, that it's something that is happening in this crisis, right? You see people simply exaggerating, not getting out of their houses. Even now that I wouldn't say we're not in a lockdown, but more or less we're kind of more free, let's say, or more free than before. Still, they don't get out. They wear their masks even when. So you think that mass hysteria has developed incredibly, right, in the COVID-19? How do you relate the COVID-19 like hysteria compared to other kinds of hysteria? You point out even like in the Spanish flu you had hysteria. So it seems the case that during epidemics it's a fertile ground for these kind of things to develop.
Yeah, it's a very fertile ground, of course. Yeah, that's what I said about the gray areas. We have this mass hysteria where there is actually no threat. There's nothing. It's just imagined, everything imagined. But there can be like a real thing, like an epidemia, and it's overestimated the threat. And this gets on top and actually kills more people. And there's one doctor or one source that I said about the Spanish flu, where they say due to the mass hysteria that developed, people that otherwise would have survived this virus of the Spanish flu easily were actually dying due to the mass hysteria and the anxiety and the fear that developed. I personally think that we live in a mass hysteria. As you say, the article is not specifically about it to prove it, because it's also hard. How would you prove it? No, how would you measure it? How would you measure it? Because you would have to measure the real threat, and what would be the appropriate real rational reaction to it, yeah, and compared with the actual reactions. So there we get into a very difficult territory, of course. But I personally think, yes, there's overreaction, there's overfear, there's over-anxiety all around us, and this has led to tremendous policy errors. And the main point of the article is that these policy area errors due to mass hysteria are much easier to develop and create much more distraction when we have a big state, a welfare state, versus a minimal state or a free society.
You don't get into this, but maybe it would be interesting to ask, aside from the state, the minimum state versus the welfare state and the consequence they have, do you think it's especially true of states, of welfare states, democratic welfare states? Maybe you would argue that if it weren't democratic welfare states, then they would think that sometime in the future they might bear the consequence of all of this, right? Whereas in a democracy, you have the idea that, okay, I'm here in power for, I don't know, a couple of years, 3-4 years. In the Italian system, I mean, the prime minister, which now is not there anymore, he was there for a couple of years, 3 years, and but then somebody else will pick up the tab, right? I mean, the sort of, there's literature also on, it's connected, at least the political business cycle literature. Do you think it's especially true of democratic welfare states or democratic centralized states, or do you think it's true of any big state that these things occur?
No, I would. It's a good question. Let me think about it. What occurs right now to me is that in a democracy, of course, then we get this special kind of public opinion, which is connected to politics, and then we get this public opinion, which has this interaction with politics. So politics does what public opinion says, and politics influences public opinion through the media. So, and I think this is a very fertile ground for such a mass hysteria to develop. If you take, for example, the case of, I think it's Belarusia, right? It's Belarusia. We have Lukashenko. No, what's his name? This dictator there. And he said, so it's now a authoritarian state, but this guy decided to say, basically coronavirus does not exist, and didn't do anything. In a democracy where politicians depend so much on public opinion, it's impossible to do. If their mass hysteria develops in the society, then the government has to respond in a democracy. There cannot be a cool-headed ruler, so to speak, who is outside the mass hysteria and behaves. Yeah, look, for example, at Trump. He was pushed through media and public opinion in the democracy to enforce lockdowns. Maybe he would not have wanted to do it. Maybe he was reluctant to do it. It seemed to me, but no, I'm not sure if that's true. But so in a democracy, I guess, if the mass hysteria develops, it's very hard to resist it, and it becomes government becomes government cannot be independent of the mass hysteria. If you would have a monarchy, for example, as to compare, then it would be possible that that the ruler would not succumb to the mass hysteria and do more rational policies or enact more rational policies. I guess in a mass democracy is much more difficult.
Interesting. Regarding the importance of fear, actually, the first you point out the various authors have talked about this, not only recent authors, but also authors going back to ancient Greece, the Greek historian Polybius. Then you also mentioned Sallust from Rome, and the relationship between fear and politics, and how politics, is enhanced or is based upon on fear. Governmental power is based on fear, and as you just said, especially in democratic states. And actually, the first epidemic, right, that we have records of, or at least the main one, which developed during the Peloponnesian War, and which Thucydides, I guess I spelled it wrong, but talks about, actually, where he says during the Peloponnesian War, he says that one of the reasons that the plague became so extensive was precisely due to the fear. The people completely succumbed to the fear, and this obviously made things much worse. There's another issue which I think you. Oh, just before talking about that, I wanted to ask you. So, the greatness or the innovation in this article is to say there's a whole bunch of literature on epidemics, a bunch of literature on mass hysteria, on nocebo effects and so forth, even with relationship to politics to some extent. But what you do is analyze everything more based on the institutions and what kind of incentive there is in different institutions. And you use a public choice, you say, your public choice perspective, and also an Austrian perspective. So I was wondering, do you think one of the reasons why there is a gap in this literature is precisely due to the fact that most people do not see these things through an Austrian or public choice perspective? And how did that allow you to see these differences, right, emanating from the different political institutions?
Yeah, of course, the article is an interdisciplinary, very interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, if you want. We have here this psychologists and medical scientists that study mass hysteria, but they, as I said, they study it more and the outbreaks are more in closed settings, like in schools. Like there are also dancing hysterias or laughing hysterias. If you start to laugh and others follow, it's then restricted to schools. But I think this is also new, that should be analyzed, the possibility of a global mass hysteria, because I think this is the first global mass hysteria. And one important thing that comes also as a other interdisciplinary point here is that social media, the contribution of social media. There are articles that show that social media contributes to the spread and contagion of fear and anxiety. Like if you're connected 24 hours, always looking what are your friends posting, and they post only negative news on a horrible virus. I mean, for example, I decided not to look any news anymore because I get anxiety also from it. And of course, no television. So the innovation.
You smashed the TV or something. You threw it out of the window.
No. But we watch Amazon Prime and this, but no channels. No news channels, right? So the innovation is to connect all this different research. This no one has done, obviously. What is the influence of social media? What is the influence, or what is mass hysteria? What are the factors contributing to it? How can it be reduced? And connect this with an Austrian or public choice perspective to analyze, different institutional settings. Where is it more likely to break out and to get big, and what can it fosters it? What are the incentives in the different institutions? And one conclusion is, of course, and it is shown that it does exist. Mass hysterias do exist. If there is a possibility of mass hysteria, then the institution of the state is a very, very dangerous institution to have. So I would like to add this as one argument against the existence of the state is the possibility of mass hysteria, because when we have a state or a big state, then mass hysteria may totally run out of control and lead to incredible destruction. And I think that is what we are seeing right now.
Interesting. And the other point you make when you discuss the different so here, for example, I have, you point out, and for everybody who wants to see this, I encourage them to read the article on the COVID survival rates, and you point out that from in general up until even people who are above 70, right, the survival rate is nearly 95%, right? And for people from 0 to 19, it's nearly 100%, right? 99.997%. From 20 to 49 years, 99.98%. From 50 to 69 years old, 99.5%. So survival rates are, very, 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 very high. And also the deaths, worldwide deaths, right, 2.1 million deaths are very small, COVID related plus, right? So it's not, necessarily just COVID, right? So are important numbers, of course, but not that important, right, to justify, or at least to make it rational. Because you say that mass hysteria not only feeds into, sort of generalized fear and generalized submission, it brings forward irrationality, right, you point out. So survival rates are very high. Deaths, relatively compared to other diseases, are not as high, and yet we have these, what you call, emergent norms or conformity among the public, where people are simply over exaggerating the risk and behaving in irrational ways. One of the things you point out, aside from what you've just said, right, so concerning the incentives, concerning the media, concerning the possibility of experimentation that you have in a minimal state or in a non-state or private law society, and you do not have in a welfare centralized state. Another reason, which I think is very interesting, is the fact that you say that, even citing very important figures like Eric von Quenneleding, that it tends to be the case that centralized states are more atheistic or less religious, whereas minimal states, or where the government is not as intrusive, tends to be more religious. And this has an impact, obviously, on the extent of the hysteria, right? The extent to which people are afraid of dying and so forth. Could you develop on that? Do you think it's also applicable to our situation?
Yeah. I'm citing there one paper that I recommend, which empirically actually investigates the correlation between the welfare state and religion or religiosity or church visits. And it shows that it's negatively correlated. The bigger the welfare state, the less religious people are, the less they attend churches. Yeah, ceteris paribus. Yeah. So, this paper makes this case basically, and the reason basically is given that the church gives charity and social security to the members, and this welfare state has assumed these functions. So one important part of the bundle of services and goods that the church and religion develops is assumed by the welfare state. So, and the state becomes a new religion. We know from Hoppe, democracy, the gods that failed, that democracy or the state is something sacred, and it takes over the importance that religion has had before. Why would we need religion right now? Because we have the all omnipotent state, right? The new God. State is the new God. So why would we need religion? And here the connection with mass hysteria is that when there's no God, for an atheist, there's no life after death. So everything that I can do here in life, or my life ends with that. Yeah. So the only precious thing that I have is my life here on Earth. Yeah. And then, of course, I'm more fearful, or tend to be more fearful of death, because when death comes, everything ends with me. If I believe, because I'm a Christian, then I believe, okay, with that, not all ends, and it will continue. I must not be totally frightened of death and think that it's the most horrible thing. I mean, we all will die at some point, right? We will all die at some point. So I will not be willing to give up everything to save my naked life. We talked about before, right? Right? Because what sense makes us to give up basically living in order to survive? Yeah. So yes, I think this is a point that plays into the development of mass hysteria, because if people don't believe in afterlife and don't believe in God, so they only believe in the state. They only believe what the state is telling them, and of course they tend to be, or can be, more fearful, yeah, of death than they otherwise would be.
There's this great quote which I wanted to mention, because I think it's great, and it's sort of prophetic, by Queneledin, man who not many people know, but was very close to Mises, and also toward the end of his life really appreciated the work of Hoppe and other Austrians. He says, and you quoted, "It is difficult to fear death if one is very pious. It is difficult not to worship health if one fears death. It is difficult to enforce general health without large-scale state intervention, and it is equally difficult to imagine increased state intervention without a loss of liberties." It seems prophetic, but actually this thing about death is something that even historians really put an emphasis on this, and scholars. I was reading this great book by Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, on the epidemic and politics, and he brings a quote precisely on death. There's this chapter on the naked life, right? This idea, as you just mentioned, right? That nowadays we want to preserve life, we want to, but ultimately, he asks, is it a life worth living? Is it really, or is it just a biological thing? And people seem to think that life is simply a matter of biology, right, and not a matter of beyond this and meaning. And he brings the quote of Montaigne. I know that as Austrians we sort of disagree with Montaigne on some issues, at least on his what Mises called the Montaigne fallacy. But he has this interesting quote on death, which Montaigne says, and the relationship between our understanding or meditation about death and the connection it has to freedom in the present. And he says, we do not know when death, or where death will wait for us, but we must wait for us everywhere. Meditation about death is meditation about liberty. He who has learned to live has unlearned to serve. Knowing to die will free us from all subjection and from all conscription. I'm translating. It's written in Italian, so I'm translating. But it's very true, actually, right? And nowadays we live in this idea that, mainly due to the state, right? The state gives us the welfare, gives us money, gives us health and universal health. We've lost this idea about death. We have this idea that being alive is a matter of a right, and so, death is some sort of excluded from the picture. And even, I would guess, our atheistic view of life obviously gives us that impression. Just a question for you. The historian Rodney, the sociologist of religion, Rodney Stark, has this great book on the rise of Christianity, where he says that one of the fundamental issues that gave birth to the rise of, not the rise of Christianity, but the fusion of the Christian faith, was precisely during the two Roman epidemics. and the biggest epidemics, right? After Christianity already arose, where the pagans simply escaped from the cities. They were like, they had such fear of death, whereas the Christians sort of tried to help one another, and this obviously created a sense of community. It was in the Christian belief that they should help other people, right, and love their neighbors as thyself. And nowadays it seems that we've lost this idea, or at least even the church. The churches have they've closed down for the first time in human history. And I don't know, what do you think about that? Does that increment mass hysteria? Because obviously, in a bad situation, not necessarily a bad situation is something that can in the long run be giving us problems. There's this interesting passage in C.S. Lewis' Screwtape Letters, where the uncle who tries to give advices to this new devil, right, that's sort of has a new patient where he tries to corrupt his soul. He's this beginner is so happy that war is there, and so he's like, that's great, so he will obviously embrace me and get separated from my enemy, which is the true God. And the uncle says, well, not too fast, because sometimes when these things happen, people try to find meaning to their lives. They look at the world in a different way, and they get more interested in the important things of what life consists of meaning, of God ultimately, right? So I was wondering, and nowadays in the church, like the fact that churches are closed, or when you get into the churches, you need to wear a mask all the time. What do you think this role has played in the mass hysteria? And do you think it's a symptom that even religion is ever more in the hands of the state, that the church is always more succumbed to the political powers of the day?
Yeah, most certainly. Being with others, socializing, helping others reduces stress, increases psychological well-being. So when the Christians helped other Christians, they stayed together, and this feeling of community, this psychologically is very good. It's very healthy. Yeah, it reduces the stress. So in such an environment, the factors that propagate mass hysteria are reduced. While when you are running away in panic, this contributes to mass hysteria. When you see others running away from panic also, then it's like the panic is then all around. So yes, I can see that this actually calms down and releases stress. And one stressful thing is, as you talk about the mask, is, for example, that if you cannot see faces of others anymore, if you don't see them smiling, this is a constant stress for us. Yeah. So that in churches we have also to wear masks. Yeah, I think it's quite unfortunate, and I agree with you that the state has incredible control over the churches, because they comply with all the restrictions of people that have to come in. They also close at 9 o'clock here in Madrid. So they obey the orders of the state, some more, some less. Of course, there are also prices that are against it, but okay.
And are you up like from now on regarding the hysteria? Do you think you're optimistic about how things will develop, or not? Do you think you're pessimistic, optimistic, long run optimist?
That is a good question. It's difficult. I think in the short run, In the short run, I'm pessimistic because I think they will try to play, or governments will try to play the lockdowns as long as they can, also to justify what they already did. I mean, this is really perverse because if they would just open up, it would like be an admission that maybe would not have been necessary. Yeah, and so I think they will try to continue with restrictions until spring. Then in summer they will open up, but it may be that they will try to play a fourth or sixth wave or something, and they already saying the vaccines are not sufficient, or the vaccines doesn't guarantee that you will get it and doesn't guarantee that you will infect others. So there is a slight danger that we will get into a continuous health dictatorship, where because they're also talking about they are framing it. It's like once we have vested, or the people who get vested, they will get some privileges. Yeah, they call it privileges when it's getting back your liberty, right? It's like it's not that they would have to give an argument to take away basic liberties. No, you have to prove with the Western that you get a privilege and can do something. Yeah. So economically, I would be in the long run also optimist, because you just have to let it work again. Yeah, you just have to take off the brake on the economic engine. I feel a little bit politically that this crisis will be used to make long-term invasions in liberties. Yeah, I hope not, but I fear that this could happen because governments also take advantage of these crises, and the mass hysteria, of course, is a perfect ground to do that. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I just to conclude, I think that's this would be an interesting question. You do not touch this issue on the paper, sorry. But I'm gonna ask this question anyhow because your like subject of expertise is the monetary sphere. How does, if anything, how does central banks monetary credit interest manipulation play in all of this hysteria, or does it play any role, or what do you where do you position, right, the monetary chaos we've been living in, the central banks and so forth?
Yeah, of course. One point to mention is, of course, that the monetary system makes so centralized and big states possible in the first place, that without it, we would not be able to have such welfare states. And of course, we would not have been able to conceal, let's say, the costs of the lockdowns without the current monetary system. Yeah, governments went into deficits, went into debts, indebted themselves, paid subsidies, all with the printing press, to maintain, and thereby concealing the real costs of it, of the lockdowns and of the restrictions. So without this, the capacity to use the printing press to conceal the costs somewhat of the lockdowns, would not have been possible to maintain it such a long term. Yeah. The other question is, of course, what does these lockdowns and these policies mean for the sustainability of the monetary system? Or will we have inflation and so on? No, this is also an interesting question. Of course, the system is much more fragile. Government debts are much higher. We are even more into the trap of zero interest rates or negative interest rates. So it seems to be ever less likely that we will get out of this without inflation. Without high inflation. we will probably pay for these policy errors in form of inflation.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for your time. It's been really a great conversation on so many issues, and I really encourage everybody to read the paper, and hopefully from 20,000 views we'll get to, I don't know, 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, and put a break on the hysteria that is making us making everybody worse off. And obviously it has, as you point out, external effects on otherwise healthy people, right? I mean, not everybody is open to this to a great degree to this hysteria, but obviously in a democracy, in a centralized state, it's very easy to externalize, and obviously being in a one-size-fits-all political system obviously makes these things much worse. So I really encourage you to read the paper, and hopefully Professor will get back to talk to each other when we'll reach 100,000 to 100,000 views. I guess, well, maybe more, because I think you'll reach them soon. So
well, thank you very much, Bernard. It was a great pleasure, and I had fun, and of course I also wanted to get the message out, because it's like the only thing that we can do in such a situation.
Definitely. So read the paper, and well, hopefully we'll get into having a new interview soon. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I thank you, Bernardo. Goodbye.